Right, we may as well start on time. Thank you very much to everybody here at the University of Canterbury on campus, and also those of you who are watching from home. This is the first time we've done a webinar like this, so fingers crossed all goes well, but so far so good. You've probably already heard me mumbling it, that I'm pleased that it's working. I'm relieved that it's working. And we're very, I think we're very grateful to welcome Stephanie Honey. She is joining us from Auckland. She is a trade policy consultant who has been involved for 25 years in international trade policy. She's formerly a trade negotiator at the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She had a period as chief agriculture negotiator in the WTO Doha round of negotiations. She's currently a senior trade policy advisor at Beef and Lamb New Zealand, a policy advisor to the New Zealand members of the APEC Business Advisory Council, and has served as Associate Director of the New Zealand International Business Forum. She's also the co-founder of a business offering executive education and trade policy, and sits on the board of the New Zealand Horticulture Export Authority and the advisory board of the Centres for Asia Pacific Excellence. Today she is talking about trade in the age of disruption, so a very timely talk. And I should also point out that all of the comments and observations are her own. They don't represent any of those amazing institutes that I've just listed. So I'll hand over to Stephanie.
Well, thank you very much, Serena, and tēnā koutou katoa. I'm glad to see the technology's working. This is a great time for all of us to learn some new digital skills. So it's great to be here with you virtually tonight. Now, as Serena mentioned, I wear many hats, but tonight I'm speaking to you in my personal capacity about trade in the age of disruption. And I think if I'd been given this speech in 2019, you might have had some very different assumptions about what disruption actually means. You might have thought that I was talking about disruption in technology, maybe something to do with Silicon Valley and digital transformation. Next slide, please, Serena. And the next one, thank you. You might have thought that I was talking about big geostrategic rivalries, the trade war or Brexit, or maybe a backlash against globalization. Or you might have thought that I was talking about sustainability and inclusion and the ways that they are disrupting the way we look at trade. But of course, it's 2020. So what I'm going to talk about includes all of those things, but I'm going to start, of course, with COVID-19. Next slide, thank you, Serena. So, I don't need to tell anybody that the pandemic has disrupted absolutely everything. We're obviously facing a terrible health crisis, more than 16 million cases, nearly 700,000 dead and counting. But we're also facing a massive global economic and trade crisis, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. The IMF is forecasting that the global economy is going to shrink by nearly 5% this year. Now, that's forecast to modestly recover next year, but overall, global GDP will be about 6.5 percentage points lower than the pre-COVID forecast would have made it. Millions will become unemployed, and 20 years of economic development could be reversed. And what's particularly sad is that the adverse impact on the poor and the most vulnerable will be particularly acute. In fact, the World Bank has estimated that we could see some 70 to 100 million people pushed back into extreme poverty. And needless to say, trade hasn't escaped this disruption. So the pandemic is, of course, disrupting production, supply chains, distribution, and consumption. It's curtailing the movement of people all around the world and affecting tourism, the movement of essential workers, and migration. And of course, all of this plays out in the trade statistics. The World Trade Organization has predicted that global trade in goods could shrink between 13 and 32%, and you can see that on the slide. That's more than trade fell during the global financial crisis, and potentially more than during the Great Depression. Trade has fallen particularly steeply in sectors where there are complex global value chains, which has become the dominant global model for trade. And so we're talking about sectors like electronics or automotive manufacturing. But even in food processing, as well as other manufacturing, factories and production plants have had to close even temporarily as a result of social distancing and illness. And that's had an impact throughout the value chain. In the services sector, the picture is even more gloomy. The pandemic has had a huge impact on transport, travel and hospitality, and that of course has wider ramifications even for goods trade, because many services are integral to the way that goods are produced and distributed across borders. And of course, unlike goods, for services, there are no inventories that can be stored for a better time. So the impact is likely to be very lasting. I guess, just as a brief digression, the one good news for the services sector is digital. With people working from home and using digital technologies in a myriad of new ways, including giving webinars via Zoom, the digital services sector has thrived. And as you can imagine, Zoom's revenue for the first half of this year has more than doubled. Next slide. Now, not surprisingly, there's been a huge hit to business and investor confidence from all of this uncertainty. This chart shows economic policy uncertainty, and you can see the effect on the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. If you could just click the slide, thanks, Serena. Then you can see the rising uncertainty from the US-China trade war in 2018 and 2019. If you could click, Serena, thank you. But when we get to 2020, uncertainty really takes off into the stratosphere. Thanks, Serena. So what has been the policy response to this change? Unfortunately, we've seen some very concerning trends, both protectionism and a move towards beggar thy neighbour approaches. Now, in the early days of the pandemic, perhaps understandably from a psychological point of view, many countries responded to the immediate crisis by slapping on export restrictions on essential medical supplies like medicines and medical equipment. And I'm sure we all read stories in the media of shipments of ventilators being hijacked and diverted elsewhere. And I'm sure you can also all remember trying to find hand sanitizer or disinfectant in the supermarkets. Now, a lot of those restrictions have been lifted now, but not all of them. And while around 106 countries have actually moved to liberalise markets for those products, there's certainly no groundswell in support of making that liberalisation permanent, for example, in the WTO. And I think it's a sad fact that this is unlikely to be the last pandemic. So we really need trade to be able to deliver those essential medical supplies to where they're needed the most, so that everybody can ultimately find a solution. And let's not forget, down the track, even if we're lucky enough to discover a COVID vaccine, we may see vaccine nationalism too, which is not good news for the world. Thanks. In other cases, countries have imposed export restrictions on food supplies. Now, of course, this risks compounding the misery of the pandemic with a food security crisis, and that has already become a live threat thanks to disruption to supply chains and production due to illness. Again, a lot of the restrictions have been removed, but not all of them. And disruption to production and supply chains has meant that other goods have been in short supply. And I'm sure we all remember these sorts of scenes. Next slide, thanks, Serena. And I hope we have all got still a stockpile of toilet paper at home. So how has this affected New Zealand, toilet paper aside? Well, New Zealand is a small, open and distant economy. So of course, the potential impacts of a global pandemic loom pretty large for us. Now, most obviously, there's been a very severe impact on our services trade, especially tourism and education. Those are exports, even though rather counterintuitively, they all happen here at home. And those two sectors make up nearly 2/3 of our services exports. Combined, they accounted for about $16 billion of export earnings last year. But of course, in both cases, they have been severely affected by the pandemic. New Zealand is highly exposed to tourism. Tourists generate over 4% of our GDP and over 5% of employment. The education sector as well, especially at tertiary level, depends significantly on foreign students coming here to study. And again, associated with the movement of people, New Zealand businesses that have an offshore presence or which depend on skilled workers coming in here, whether it's in the horticulture sector or some manufacturing businesses, are also struggling. For goods exports, so far, the impact has been relatively modest, and that's what you can see on this slide. Overall goods trade is tracking at about the same level as it was last year. That's that top line, which is actually the brown 2020 line overlaid over the top of the green 2019 line. And in some sectors, especially in dairy, meat and fruit, the sector has in fact performed much better than in 2020 compared to 2019 or the year before. Unfortunately, other sectors, including seafood, forest products and manufactured goods, are performing less well. But of course, in the food and beverage sector overall, our reputation for safe, high quality, nutritious, healthy, innovative and sustainable food stands us in very good stead. Now, that's not to say it has been easy for goods exporters. Of course, they've had significant challenges around supply chains, around accessing freight, capacity, delays in ports, delays in distribution channels, the handling of export documentation in lots of our markets. And they've also had in-market challenges. So lots of food and beverage companies have had to pivot in the kinds of products that they send overseas as the food service sector, so that's restaurants and schools and so on, and other customers of consumer-ready foods have been locked down. Now, on a positive note, in a trade policy sense, there have been very few formal trade restrictions that have been introduced on the vast majority of our exports. And some of those earlier challenges around transport and logistics are also improving. The New Zealand government has also led the way with trying to generate new trade agreements and new statements on supply chains and trade flows, including with like-minded countries like Singapore, and strong statements in the WTO on food trade, for example. But of course, the broader impact on global markets and the flow-on effects into the New Zealand small and open economy can't be ignored. As I mentioned earlier, GDP globally is forecast to shrink by nearly 5% this year. In advanced, wealthy economies, the impact will be greater, and even in important emerging markets and developing economies, the effects will be felt. In China, for example, which has long been the engine of global economic growth, GDP is forecast to increase by 1% this year. That doesn't sound so bad, but it's well below the 6 to 7% that had been projected earlier. What that means for real people is that jobs will be lost, sovereign debt will rise significantly, there may be impacts on social cohesion, and certainly a lot of human suffering. But even with the best economic crystal ball, much depends on how the scientific and medical experts fare on drug treatments and vaccine developments, and how effectively countries may be able to either control or stamp out the virus. Overall, it's fair to say that the impacts will be uneven. Some of our important markets will recover more quickly than others, depending on the policy choices they make, and maybe some luck. So you can see on this slide the trajectory for China on the left there, if you would mind clicking, Serena, and the US, which are respectively our first and fourth largest markets. You can see there's a very different trajectory for both of those markets, at least at this stage. Now, Australia, our second largest market, is in a technical recession. It's predicted to have a W-shaped recovery, which means essentially a lot of volatility. Things will get better, they'll get worse, and then hopefully gradually better again. Similarly, Europe, our third largest market, is still trying to get on top of the virus, and there could be some rocky road ahead there. So, as I said before, what happens in global markets, and especially in our important trading partners, has a flow-on effect into the domestic economy. Challenges to our exports, constraints on the movement of people, they're all a major drag on what happens here at home. MFAT, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, has previously estimated that about 620,000 New Zealand jobs depend on exports. So a poor outlook for global trade is not great news for us. And the Treasury has forecast that we may see a 10% contraction in GDP this year and close to 10% unemployment. So that's not a great story, but unfortunately, the disruption that I'm talking to you about tonight is not just about COVID. The pandemic hit at a time when the global trading system had already been suffering from some setbacks, some major disruptions, and I'm going to talk about a few of those. Thanks, Serena. First, since the global financial crisis back in 2008 and 2009, unfortunately, we've seen rising protectionism. So that's measures taken by other governments to constrain trade. It's been estimated that we have seen about over 4,000 new trade restrictive or harmful interventions in trade over the last decade. And those are things like subsidies, contingent measures, so anti-dumping duties, for example, tariffs, and a host of other measures. And this has hit a large share of global trade. The WTO has estimated that nearly 10% of global goods trade has been hit by import restrictive measures and counting. And those restrictions are becoming more widespread. So you can see on this slide on the left, there's a global map of harmful interventions from 2009 to 2019. That was bad enough. And you can see that the US and China are in a sort of darker shade there, reflecting the trade war of the last few years. But in 2020, the restrictions are becoming much more widespread. And overall, the impact is to dampen down economic growth and trade growth. Thanks, Serena. Now, one of the most worrying trends since COVID-19 has been a surge in economic nationalism, and many countries are responding, understandably enough and appropriately enough, with massive monetary and fiscal stimulus to try to mitigate the effects on employment and business failures, and rightly so. But we're also seeing increasing pressure for diversification, for reshoring supply chains, for focusing more inwardly, and for heavily restricting foreign investment. So the new trade strategy for the EU, for example, is called Strategic Open Autonomy. Interesting juxtaposition of openness and autonomy there. The US and Japan are both offering incentives to companies to bring supply chains and production back home. And the subsidies that have justifiably been given to try to mitigate the worst impacts of the pandemic may actually turn out to be difficult to dismantle down the track, even when they're not needed anymore. And that can all add up to further distortions in global markets. But to hark back to my original theme, the raft of disruptions we're facing, unfortunately, these COVID trends are coming on the back of a general slowdown in global trade expansion. We've seen over the last few years a shortening and a regionalisation of supply chains, along with a reduction of trade intensity. And the McKinsey Global Institute has written an interesting paper on this, published last year, in which they describe the process as slowbalization, the next stage on from globalization. And let's not forget another significant disruption in the trade world. The pandemic has come hot on the heels of 2 years of a disruptive trade war, or trade tensions as they're sometimes more diplomatically described. Now, those trade tensions, if you haven't followed them, have involved multiple fronts. We've seen US tariffs on imports of steel and aluminium on grounds of national security. We've seen tariffs on imports from China on grounds of unfair trade practices for technology and for intellectual property violations. We've seen repeated threats of trade on autos. And we've also seen, in response to those US tariffs, other countries retaliate with their own tariffs and the launching of WTO disputes, complaining about what the US has been doing. And of particular interest to our farm sector, we've seen the US respond to those retaliatory tariffs with subsidies, around $28 billion and counting, to US farmers. Now, the trade war might be in the way of being resolved. Earlier this year, the US struck, or late last year, I should say, the US struck what's described as a phase 1 trade deal with China, intended to take some of the heat out of those tensions. But of course, COVID means that it will be very difficult for China to meet some of the requirements of that trade deal, which included buying a lot of agricultural exports. If the trade war hots up again, if China is unable to meet its commitments, New Zealand exports risk becoming collateral damage, and that's obviously not great news in this disrupted environment either. Next slide. Now, the last few years have also seen disruption to some of the fundamental architecture of the global rules-based trading system. Now, these days, everybody is in the FTA or free trade agreement game. For New Zealand, we're very focused on APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, and lots of other innovative new ways to govern global economic action. But fundamentally, the World Trade Organization is at the heart of the global rules-based trading system. through its binding trade rules and the trade liberalisation that it's achieved, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted from poverty, and the world has really enjoyed over 70 years of increasing prosperity year on year, thanks to that WTO system. The WTO has also meant that small countries like New Zealand have been able to operate on a relatively level playing field. We don't have the economic heft of a US or a China or the gunboats of the bad old days to have our way in global trade. So we need the rules of the WTO system. And even though we now have lots of FTAs, including around the Asia Pacific and under negotiation with Europe and the UK, the WTO system still remains the underpinning of all of those diverse trade relationships. But the WTO is facing some significant disruption. There's been a gradual process of increasing political and economic upheaval in the WTO. First of all, the WTO has really been facing a crisis of credibility. One of the functions of the WTO is to negotiate new trade deals, but WTO members have not been able to find the political will to negotiate new trade rules, either to make those difficult reform decisions or even to keep new trade rules pacing alongside modern trade models, despite strenuous efforts over the last 20 years. A second problem has been in the dispute settlement system, sometimes described as the jewel in the crown of the WTO because of the binding options that are offered even for small countries. Now, the US has refused to appoint new members to the appeals part of that system, known as the appellate body. And this has meant that in effect, trade disputes can't be taken to their final conclusion. And that's a very worrying prospect for small countries like New Zealand. Most recently, the WTO membership is needing to appoint a new Director General. The existing incumbent, Roberto Azevedo of Brazil, announced recently that he was stepping down a year early. Now, it's absolutely unquestionable that the process to appoint a new Director General will not be straightforward and is likely to be very politicised. But even when a new individual is appointed, they have a formidable task ahead of them. The new DG will need to rebuild trust, will need to rebuild credibility, and really will need to rebuild the social licence for the global rules-based system. They will also have to try to help facilitate the development of a new package of outcomes, possible negotiating solutions that WTO members could agree at next year's WTO Ministerial Conference. But above all of that, they will need to oversee a global effort towards economic recovery and rebuilding, all against the backdrop of a pandemic and pandemic-inspired economic nationalism. The next disruption that I'd like to talk about is digital. We're living through what is really probably one of the most seminal changes in our lives in the form of global digital transformation. Now, digital technology has had a huge impact on all aspects of trade. It's developed new ways to produce products and new ways to trade. It's stripped out lots of trade cost and friction and made supply chains more secure and transparent. It's generated new products like Netflix and Spotify and cloud computing that probably most people watching this webinar wouldn't immediately think of as trade. And it's created new ways to trade like e-commerce. Artificial intelligence and robotics, automation will transform things even further. And of course, from the point of view of inclusion, digital has opened up huge new opportunities for small businesses, for women, for Māori, by reducing some of those challenges of the tyranny of distance that's always been the New Zealand trade narrative. Now, for New Zealand, we already have a pretty thriving digital sector, including high-tech manufacturing, digital media and digitally enabled creative economy, exports, gaming and fintech, and there's clearly scope to increase trade in those sectors. In fact, overall digital trade is growing. Cross-border business-to-consumer e-commerce is projected to be around $1 trillion this year, and business-to-business e-commerce perhaps 6 or 7 times that amount. And you can see on this slide here, if we take cross-border data flows as a proxy for digital trade, it's clear that something pretty major is happening, even over the last 15 years. Data flows are surging and they're on a steep upwards trajectory. In fact, to give you a couple of good illustrations of this, Cross-border data flows, even by 2015, were generating more economic growth than trade in goods. And the World Bank has estimated that if e-commerce were a sovereign economy, it would be bigger than Australia and growing faster than China. Now, in general, digital technology and digital business models have tended to outstrip regulation and what trade policy has been able to do. Unfortunately, that's meant that we've seen some very hasty responses from officials and governments to restrict digital trade, often for legitimate reasons like privacy or trust, but not always in the most trade-friendly way, and in some cases for very overt protectionist motivations. So New Zealand, I'm proud to say, has been doing some really creative trade policy thinking here. For example, in striking a new deal with Singapore and Chile about how to govern the digital economy. But there's really quite a long way to go before we have global rules for what is essentially a global digital economy. And ideally that would be done in the WTO. And of course, to bring us back to COVID, the pandemic has really only served to highlight the importance of getting the policy settings right for digital trade and digital ways of working. Next slide, thanks. Finally, there's been a huge disruption to the way that people think about trade. Over the last decade or so, there's been a serious backlash against globalization. Sometimes quite unfairly, trade has been blamed for all manner of social ills. But there's been a real sense, especially in Western economies, that trade has really failed everyday people. So the response that we've seen to that has been an increasing emphasis on ensuring that trade and growth actually deliver better outcomes for people, for equity and for sustainability, and for inclusion. In a way, what we're trying to achieve now is smarter globalization. Now, this has been a particular concern for New Zealand, and the government has worked hard on a new strategy called Trade for All, where there's a big emphasis on helping small businesses, women, Māori and regional New Zealand to trade more successfully. And of course, that taps into the biggest potential disruptor of all, climate change and sustainability. It's good to see that this is now becoming more prominent in trade policy discussions. And also that, again, New Zealand is at the forefront of creative, some might even say disruptive thinking about how to better match up trade and sustainability concerns. In other words, how to make trade work better for sustainable outcomes. And some of the things that New Zealand has been pushing in this space include, for example, eliminating fossil fuel subsidies or fish subsidies through trade rules, or by trying to liberalise trade in products that help achieve better environmental outcomes. And we're working hard to broaden that discourse so that other countries come on board those sorts of initiatives too. Now, where to next? Well, when I first started in trade policy, I think Serena said 25 years ago, it feels more like 100 years ago, there were some pretty clear assumptions that everybody around the world made about trade. Markets were progressively opening up and economies were becoming ever more integrated. Global trade rules were in place and mostly everybody followed them most of the time. Old-fashioned ideas like mercantilism and zero-sum games were discredited. And the idea of trade happening weightlessly or in the cloud was simply unthinkable. But the developments of recent years are really shaking those assumptions to their foundations in all the ways that I've just talked about. Now, COVID-19 is likely to magnify some, if not all of those trends in some good ways, but also in some bad ways. One thing's clear, it seems unlikely that we're going to go back to business as usual. Some sectors might be winners, some others, some economies, some groups may struggle, perhaps for a long time to come. This is an age of disruption, but it's also an age of suffering. But having said that, I'm not entirely pessimistic. In some ways, COVID actually gives us a chance to speed up the transition to a more digital, more resilient, more inclusive and more green economy. Now, of course, in trying to strive towards that outcome, New Zealand will have its work cut out for it, trying to maintain friends, alliances and influence in the shifting sands of the global system. Not just in the face of the pandemic-induced economic nationalism, but also trying to steer a path through the geo-economic and geopolitical tensions that were already evident before COVID, especially between the US and China. But we have some fantastic diplomats, officials, political leaders, business leaders, academics who can help us to achieve that. It's certainly true that global problems demand global solutions, and it doesn't get more global than COVID-19. Policymakers will need all the tools that they can get to help pull all of our economies out of this crisis, including centrally by keeping trade flowing. So our collective challenge as we look to navigate through this disrupted landscape is to do what we can to ensure that we're all pulling in the same direction. Thank you.
Okay, so any questions for Stephanie? Just checking my screen to see if anyone, if you wish to ask some questions, you can do so on chat if you're at home. I might stop the recording.